My name is Helena, and until last week, I was the woman everyone at family gatherings forgot to greet. For the last 15 years, I've been the quiet presence in the corner of our sprawling country home, the widow who supposedly had her time. My son Adam and his wife Clara moved in 5 years ago, taking over the main rooms while I retreated to the smaller guest wing. Clara, always perfectly manicured and impeccably dressed, called it graciously allowing me space, like she was doing me a favor in my own house. I let her have her illusions. She always thought I was too slow, too simple, too outdated to understand her world. She'd speak over me at dinner, wave me away when I tried to help in the kitchen, and once whispered to a guest, "Helena just likes to linger in the background." I was a museum relic to her, something she tolerated for the aesthetics. But Clara made a grave mistake when she decided to borrow one of my old rings for her gala. She had no idea she was walking out with a $3 million pink diamond that could destroy her entire life. If you have a similar story about betrayal from the people you least expect, tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, when the house buzzed with preparations for some exclusive charity event. Clara had been pacing in her heels since morning, cursing her stylist for forgetting a necklace and blaming her assistant for not finding a matching clutch. Adam stayed out of it, like he always did, offering distracted nods between calls. I was pruning roses in the garden, just like I had every Saturday since Richard, my husband, passed. I heard footsteps echo through the open hallway window and saw Clara in my suite, standing in front of my old vanity. She had no idea I could see her. She opened my antique jewelry box, the one I kept next to the framed photo of Richard and me, and rifled through it like she was browsing a bargain bin. Then, with a little gasp of delight, she held up the rose gold ring with the pink diamond. She slipped it on, twirled her hand in the light, smirked, and walked out without closing the box. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just another insult. It was a theft. A few minutes later, I got the message. "Hope you don't mind, Helena. I borrowed that old pink ring for the party tonight. It really goes with my dress. I'll return it tomorrow, hugs and kisses." No question mark. No hesitation. No idea what she had just done. I didn't reply at first. I sat there on the bench under the garden archway, the late summer breeze brushing through my hair, and thought about what Richard would have done. He had always told me, people will underestimate you because you're quiet. Use it. And so I smiled, typed back, "Have fun tonight, dear," and went inside to make a phone call. The moment my lawyer Evelyn answered, I said 5 words: initiate inventory theft. Item 243. Her tone changed instantly. "Is this about the pink diamond?" It had a name, that ring, the Larkspur. Richard bought it at a private auction in 1986, a one-of-a-kind Art Deco piece created by a reclusive French jeweler who only made 6 pieces before his mysterious death. I never wore it out. It was too valuable, too personal. But I kept it close because it reminded me of the man who knew beauty without needing to show it off. Evelyn had helped us register the ring as part of our insured collection when we revised the will. Item 243, appraised at $3.1 million, with full documentation, certificates of authenticity, and a direct link to international stolen asset registries in case it ever went missing. I had never told Adam about the ring, or about most of Richard's collection. We wanted it kept private, safe from opportunists and gossip. But now Clara had made the first move. She had drawn blood. Evelyn moved quickly. Within 30 minutes, the ring was reported as stolen property, and a digital alert was sent to our insurance network. Clara had no clue she was about to walk into a gala full of jewelers, collectors, and socialites, many of whom would recognize the Larkspur instantly. I made myself a cup of tea, humming softly as I poured the water, while Evelyn coordinated with Detective Breyer from the city's Property Crimes Division. He was young but sharp, and when he read the ring's profile, he said, "We'll have a team at the event before dessert." I imagined Clara strutting in, holding champagne, raising her hand to flaunt the vintage touch on her finger. She'd probably even invent a story. "Oh, just an old family heirloom from my husband's side." The irony made me laugh. She never once cared about our family's history, and now it was going to bite her in public. The gala was being held at the Versailles Hotel downtown, a marble and crystal fortress where people spent more time gossiping than donating. Clara had been obsessed with impressing the wives of tech investors and fashion moguls. She'd spent thousands on her dress, her hair, and a rented chauffeur to drive her there like royalty. What she didn't realize was that the moment she stepped into that ballroom, she triggered a silent alarm. One of the insurance company's undercover operatives, planted specifically for high-risk jewelry cases, spotted the ring within minutes. He confirmed its identity through high-resolution photography and called Breyer immediately. By the time the shrimp cocktail was served, 3 plainclothes officers were already inside. Clara was too busy enjoying the attention to notice. It wasn't until they politely asked to speak with her in private that her champagne glass began to tremble. Meanwhile, I sat in my quiet room, sipping Earl Grey and listening to Chopin. Adam called me in a panic just as the appetizers were being cleared. "Mom, the police are here. They're saying Clara stole a $3 million ring. Please tell me this is a mistake." I could hear the desperation in his voice, the disbelief. "Adam," I said gently, "that ring she took was not an accessory. It was a protected asset from your father's estate. She had no permission to touch it." There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "Why didn't I know about it?" he asked finally. "Because your father wanted to protect the collection from people who valued things for the wrong reasons," I said. And Clara just proved why we were right. I hung up before he could say anything else. Clara tried to claim it was a misunderstanding. She told Detective Breyer she thought it was just a costume piece, an old ring I didn't care about. She cried, tried to appeal to the officer's sympathy, mentioned how I'd always been generous. But the officers had the documentation. The ring had been clearly photographed, inventoried, and tied to a security protocol that included an alert system. More importantly, she had admitted in her message that she borrowed it without asking. That text alone sealed her fate. Breyer informed her that she was being detained for questioning under suspicion of grand theft. Clara collapsed in tears, smudging her makeup, demanding Adam fix it. But he stood frozen, holding his phone, staring at my last message. She took something that wasn't hers. Detective Breyer escorted Clara from the ballroom with quiet professionalism, ignoring the clicking phones and whispers spreading like wildfire. Her gold gown trailed behind her, wrinkled and limp, no longer radiant under the chandelier lights. The ring had been removed from her finger and sealed in an evidence pouch, a clear plastic square that now held the symbol of her undoing. In the police car, Clara sobbed the entire ride, claiming over and over that it was all a misunderstanding, that she was family, that Helena wouldn't do this. Breyer remained silent until they arrived at the precinct, where he informed her that any further comments would be documented for the report. Meanwhile, Evelyn forwarded a full dossier to the detectives, including high-resolution appraisals, chain of custody documents, and photos showing the ring in my possession over the years. There was no ambiguity. Clara hadn't just borrowed something pretty, she had stolen a protected asset registered under federal guidelines. Evelyn made sure everything was watertight. Clara's crocodile tears meant nothing against cold, hard paperwork. Back at the house, I walked slowly into Richard's old study, now converted into a private archive room where I kept our estate records. The scent of mahogany and aged paper welcomed me like an old friend, and I sat at the roll-top desk, running my hand over the polished surface. A part of me mourned what had happened, not because I felt sympathy for Clara, but because it marked a final fracture in what was left of our family peace. Adam had once been so close to me, a boy who brought me wildflowers and called me his brilliant mama. But as the years passed and Clara gained influence, I watched that version of my son recede behind a new mask, one of compliance and silence. He allowed her to control the narrative, to dictate who I was allowed to be in my own home. When he proposed moving in, he promised it would help me feel less alone. Instead, it made me feel like a ghost in the house I built. Tonight, though, something shifted. The silence broke. Adam returned just past midnight, his car headlights sweeping across the front porch as he pulled up. I heard the door slam, the hurried click of his shoes across the stone tiles, and the creak of the hallway floor. I didn't get up. I waited, letting him come to me like he always used to when he scraped a knee or failed a test. "Mom," he said, breathless, stepping into the study like a man who'd just escaped a nightmare. His tie was askew, his face pale, and the panic hadn't left his eyes. "They're keeping her overnight. They're saying this could go to court. You have to help us." I looked up slowly, folding the leather-bound ledger I'd been reviewing. "No, Adam," I said, and my voice was steady. "I don't have to do anything anymore." He stared at me like I'd struck him. "She didn't mean to steal it, Mom. She thought it was just costume jewelry." I tilted my head, narrowing my eyes. "Then why didn't she ask first?" I said. "Why did she sneak into my room, open my jewelry box, and text me after she already left?" He stammered, searching for answers that wouldn't come. She just wanted to impress people," he finally said, as if that were an excuse. "And that justifies taking something that doesn't belong to her?" I asked. He didn't respond. Instead, he sank into the leather chair across from me, suddenly looking older than his 38 years. "You're serious about pressing charges?" I opened a drawer and placed a manila folder between us, labeled Estate Inventory, Private Assets. "This isn't just about a ring, Adam," I said. "This is about a pattern, a decade of her treating me like I was disposable." He looked down at the folder, hesitant to open it. "That ring was the tip of the iceberg. Your father left me pieces worth millions, and I kept them quiet to protect our family. Clara never respected that legacy. She never respected me." Adam finally opened the folder, flipping through appraisal reports, high-res images, provenance documentation, the full truth he'd never been shown. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I thought you were just keeping old heirlooms around for sentimental reasons." I smiled sadly. "You didn't know because you never asked." He stayed quiet for a long time, studying the documents like they were puzzle pieces of a family he no longer recognized. "Do you really think Clara meant to hurt you?" he asked, his voice small. I stood and walked toward the bookshelf, pulling down a small velvet box with a golden clasp. Inside was a brooch I hadn't worn in years, another piece Clara had once called tacky. "Intentions matter less than patterns," I replied. "She's spent years humiliating me, brushing me aside, using this house like her playground. The ring wasn't the first violation, it was the last straw." Adam looked up, guilt washing over his features like a slow tide. "I should have seen it," he said. "I should have stood up for you." I sat back down. "You still can." The next morning, the phone rang at 7:43 a.m. sharp. Evelyn's voice was brisk and efficient as always. "They've officially booked her," she said. "Charge is grand theft over $1 million. Bail is set, but the judge won't release her until a formal hearing." I nodded, scribbling notes on my legal pad. "What's the DA's angle?" I asked. "They're reviewing it as a high-profile theft due to the ring's documented value and Clara's social status," Evelyn said. "And the fact that she took it without consent, despite having a text acknowledging the act, makes it airtight." I felt no triumph, only a cold resolve. "Let them proceed," I said. "This time, I'm not backing down." Later that afternoon, I received a visit from Peter Langston, a private investigator Evelyn had quietly hired 6 months ago. I had told her something felt wrong, items missing, drawers disturbed, nothing I could prove until now. Peter was in his 50s, lean and quiet, with a folder of photos he laid on the coffee table like tarot cards. "Mrs. Helena," he began, "Clara's been slowly lifting items from your collection for over a year." My breath caught. "What?" I asked. "Small things," he continued, showing me photos of her at pawn shops, antique dealers, even shipping centers. "Vintage brooches, pearl earrings, one emerald bracelet. We estimate she's sold off nearly $80,000 in assets so far, all traceable." My heart thudded, not in anger, but in confirmation. I had known, I just hadn't wanted to believe it. Peter slid another photo across the table, this one showing Clara in a red trench coat exiting a boutique pawn dealer in the city's West End. She held a small black pouch, identical to the kind I stored my antique brooches in, her expression casual and confident. "She's been doing this carefully," Peter said, tapping the image. "No large withdrawals, no flashy spending all at once, just slow, Steady liquidation. I stared at the photo, my fingers curling slightly around the edge. I remembered the brooch she had once mocked, calling it overly ornate, vanishing from my drawer months ago. I had searched the house twice, then told myself I was just getting forgetful, that maybe I misplaced it during a move between rooms. Clara must have seen my doubt and used it against me, encouraging Adam to gently suggest I organize my things more often. The nerve of it all struck me now like a slap. We've traced 7 confirmed sales, Peter continued. Likely more, but these are the ones where she used her real name. Evelyn arrived 20 minutes later, her shoes clicking sharply against the tile as she entered the sitting room. She was dressed in a navy pantsuit and carried a legal briefcase under one arm, her expression unreadable. "The DA's office is moving quickly," she said without preamble. "They've got the text, the photos, and now Peter's findings. We're looking at a minimum of 3 felony charges." I nodded, motioning for her to sit. "Clara's lawyer is already posturing," she added. "They're going to try the emotional misunderstanding angle, maybe claim she thought she had permission because of proximity and family ties." I let out a humorless laugh. That woman wouldn't ask me to pass the salt at dinner without rolling her eyes. Evelyn didn't smile. "I need to know, Helena, do you want to press full charges or just recover your property?" I looked between Evelyn and Peter, weighing the question with more care than I had expected. Pressing charges meant destroying whatever public reputation Clara still clung to, dragging Adam through courtrooms and media storms. It meant sitting in depositions, revisiting every slight and humiliation, proving my sanity and ownership at every turn. But not pressing charges meant sending the message that her years of contempt had been acceptable, that a tearful apology could erase systematic abuse and calculated theft. "She's been selling pieces for over a year," I said aloud, as much to myself as them, all while making me think I was losing my mind. Peter nodded, setting another photo down, this time of a gold locket I hadn't even noticed was gone. "She's not sorry," I said. "She's just caught." Evelyn didn't blink. "Then we press." Word traveled fast. By that evening, Adam had locked himself in his study, emerging only once to ask Evelyn if there was any way to settle this quietly. She told him the evidence was overwhelming and the DA had already filed the first motion. Clara's mugshot appeared online an hour later, posted by an anonymous source who likely worked in the courthouse. The photo was unflattering, her eyes red from crying, hair disheveled, makeup ruined, but her expression was unmistakably angry. The story spread across social media like wildfire. Socialite arrested for stealing $3 million ring from her own mother-in-law. Comments ranged from gleeful mockery to shocked disbelief. I tried not to read them, but I saw enough to know the narrative was clear. I wasn't the villain in this story. My silence for all those years had finally given way to a roar. And people were listening. The next morning, Adam and I sat across from each other at the breakfast table in a silence that felt older than the house. He stirred his coffee 3 times before speaking. "She's asking for you," he said. I didn't look up. "In jail?" I asked. "No, she's out on bail. Her lawyer moved quickly last night." I raised an eyebrow. "And what does she want?" Adam sighed. "She wants to apologize. She says she didn't know the ring was worth that much. She says if you forgive her, she'll return everything." I folded my napkin slowly. Forgiveness doesn't undo theft. And she didn't take that ring because it looked worthless. She took it because she thought I was. Peter returned later that day with more findings, a full timeline of Clara's unauthorized entries into my suite. "We checked the security footage from the side entrance," he explained, placing a USB stick on the table. "She used the key fob 6 different times over the past year, all when you were either out gardening or visiting the estate office. Most of the entries lasted no more than 5 minutes. Evelyn was already typing notes into her laptop, her brow furrowed. "Each visit lines up with a missing item," Peter added. "We matched the timestamps to photos taken at the pawn shops and galleries." She had a whole system in place. I leaned back in my chair, the realization settling over me like fog. "She treated me like I was some doddering old woman," I whispered. "She counted on me never noticing, never remembering. But I did. That evening, the phone rang again, Clara, this time, not through Adam, but directly. Her voice was hoarse, less polished than I'd ever heard it, almost unfamiliar. Helena, she began, and there was a pause like she expected me to hang up. I didn't. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said. I thought it was just one ring. I didn't know about the rest. I didn't know it was catalogued. I stayed silent. I've made mistakes, okay? She continued. But I've also done things for this family. I kept this house beautiful, hosted events, helped Adam. I finally spoke. You did all that for your ego. And you stole because you thought no one would stop you. The next day, Detective Breyer arrived at the house to collect additional statements and review the latest evidence Peter had uncovered. He was respectful, quiet, methodical, and made it clear the case was stronger than ever. Between the ring and the additional sales, we're looking at charges beyond grand theft, he explained. Fraud, false statements, possible fencing if we prove she misrepresented the origin of the items to dealers. I handed him a folder with old receipts and photographs that proved chain of ownership dating back decades. I don't want to ruin her life, I told him honestly. But I won't protect someone who spent years ruining mine. He nodded. You're not doing this out of revenge. You're doing this because it's justice. And somehow, that distinction made everything feel just a little easier to carry. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. 3 days after Clara's arrest, the front gates buzzed with media vans, their antennas rising like metal flowers in bloom. Reporters from local stations stood on the sidewalk with microphones, rehearsing lines about a shocking betrayal within a wealthy estate. I watched them from the drawing room window, my teacup steady in hand, the storm outside not touching the calm inside. Evelyn had warned me this might happen once the charges became public and the story gained traction beyond social media. You're a symbol now, she'd said. A reminder that silence doesn't mean stupidity. Adam, on the other hand, had retreated further into his shame, barely speaking at meals and often leaving the house for long, aimless drives. He hadn't gone to visit Clara again, and I hadn't asked if he would. A part of him was still wrestling with the truth that he had been complicit, not by action, but by indifference. And I knew too well how guilt could sit heavier than blame. That afternoon, the estate received an unexpected visitor, a woman named Elise Roman, the owner of the high-end gallery Clara had frequented twice over the last year. She was in her early 60s, dressed in a tailored gray coat, with silver-streaked hair and sharp, alert eyes. I came as soon as I saw the story, she said, seated across from me in the parlor. Clara sold us 2 pieces, a brooch and a set of earrings, both marked as inheritance from her grandmother. My stomach turned. Did she give names or documents? I asked. Elise nodded. Forged appraisals. I have copies. Something about her story never sat right with me, but she was poised, convincing. I handed her one of Peter's printouts. This is the real provenance, I said. Elise exhaled sharply. Then she's not just a thief, she's a fraud. Elise's testimony became critical to the expanding case, especially once she agreed to cooperate with the district attorney's office. I'm not interested in protecting her, Elise had said firmly. I've built my gallery on authenticity, not shady stories and stolen heirlooms. Her words resonated with me deeply, the idea of legacy, of truth being worth more than appearances. Evelyn scheduled a deposition with Elise 2 days later, and by then, 4 more small dealers had come forward. Each had their own version of Clara's deception, false names, exaggerated backstories, emotionally manipulative tales of sudden financial hardship. I listened to every one of them, surprised at how detailed her lies had been. Clara hadn't been desperate. She had been deliberate. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment mistake. This was a pattern. Adam came into my room late that night, holding a worn envelope in his hand. He looked pale, his hair unkempt, his shirt wrinkled as if he hadn't bothered to change all day. This came in the mail, he said, placing the envelope on my nightstand. It's from Clara. I didn't move to open it. Did you read it? I asked. No, he said. But I thought you might want to. I stared at the envelope for a long while after he left, the handwriting unfamiliar and its neatness controlled, almost rehearsed. When I finally opened it, the letter was exactly what I expected. It was full of rationalizations, justifications wrapped in hollow apologies, and a final plea that I not let this consume us all. The last line read, "I never meant to hurt you, Helena. I only wanted to matter." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and disintegrated into ash, the words vanishing in silence. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel relief. I felt clarity, a recognition that Clara had always seen herself as the victim, even in her cruelty. She had used charm like a blade, carving herself into rooms she had no right to enter, stealing both objects and dignity without ever looking back. And when consequences finally came, she wrapped herself in innocence like a child caught with stolen candy. But this was no childish prank. This was theft, manipulation, exploitation. The house she once treated like a personal palace had become the evidence locker of her downfall. And I had finally stopped being the quiet observer. 2 days later, the district attorney's office called with a formal update. "Mrs. Helena," the assistant DA began, "the grand jury has reviewed the evidence and returned an indictment." I nodded, phone pressed firmly to my ear. "Clara is being charged with first-degree grand larceny, possession of stolen property, and wire fraud." I sat in silence as she outlined the process ahead: court dates, potential plea bargains, and the likely media frenzy. Evelyn, who was on speaker beside me, asked a series of precise legal questions. The assistant DA answered them professionally, but with an underlying tone of gravity. "She could face 5 to 15 years, she said finally. "But if she cooperates fully with asset recovery, the judge might lean toward the lower end." "And if she doesn't?" Evelyn asked. "Then we pursue the full weight of the law." The media attention intensified by the end of the week. Several outlets had picked up Elisa's gallery statement and were now calling it one of the most bizarre high society cons in recent memory. A woman from a morning news show called asking for an interview, promising a sympathetic platform to share my side of the story. I declined. I had no interest in becoming a media figure or martyr. All I wanted was for the truth to be recorded, not just in courtrooms, but in the minds of those who had watched me disappear for years. Neighbors who once walked past me in the grocery store without a second glance now looked with awkward recognition. Friends of Clara who once smiled at me with pity now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Even the household staff, who had been instructed to treat Clara as lady of the manor, now paused to ask if I needed anything before retiring for the evening. I hadn't become louder. I had just become impossible to ignore. The estate quieted in the days that followed, like the air after a storm, the kind that leaves everything standing but changed. Adam and I began speaking more, hesitantly at first, then with increasing honesty. He apologized not with flowers or grand gestures, but with questions. "What was Dad really like when you first met him?" he asked one evening, sitting across from me as I sorted old photographs. It was the first time he had asked me something personal in years. I told him about Richard's wit, his stubbornness, his love of jazz music and late-night chess games. I told him about our first apartment with the leaky pipes and how we used to laugh under umbrellas in the living room. Adam smiled, his expression softening. "I wish I'd known more," he said. I looked at him kindly. "You still can." The first pretrial hearing arrived sooner than expected, held in a modest courtroom draped in polished wood and quiet tension. Evelyn sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, her notes meticulously organized and her presence like a fortress. Clara entered from a side door, not in her designer gowns or glittering jewelry, but in a beige suit 2 sizes too large, her hair pulled back and her expression hollow. She glanced toward us once, not with remorse, not even with anger, but with something closer to disbelief, as if she still couldn't fathom I had followed through. Adam sat behind me, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned pale, his breathing slow and shallow. The judge, a woman named Justice Hartwell, was firm and efficient, reviewing the formal charges before turning her attention to the defense. Clara's attorney, a sharp-jawed man named Stanton Lowe, claimed his client had misunderstood the informal nature of the household arrangement and had no intention of theft. Evelyn's lips barely twitched. The judge raised an eyebrow. She took a $3 million ring from a locked bedroom without consent, she said flatly. That doesn't sound informal to me. The hearing continued for 42 minutes, mostly procedural steps and motions for document review. At one point, Stanton argued that the inventory documents were unfamiliar to the defendant and that no formal training in asset valuation had been provided. Evelyn stood. Your Honor, the defendant runs a fashion blog specializing in jewelry analysis, has attended 4 Sotheby's events, and has published 6 posts on gemstone quality in the last year alone, she stated. The room went silent for a breath before Judge Hartwell responded. So the defendant knew exactly what she was holding, she said, turning a page in her binder. Stanton quickly dropped the line of argument. Clara didn't look up once during the exchange, her gaze fixed on the wood grain of the defense table. When the session ended, the judge set the next hearing for 30 days later and denied the request for case dismissal. As we exited the courtroom, Evelyn leaned in and whispered, "She's starting to realize this won't go away." Back at the estate, life returned to its slow rhythms, but nothing felt quite the same. The staff now addressed me directly, no longer checking with Clara for approval on changes to the household calendar. The gardener, Martin, brought me a basket of clipped lavender one afternoon and said softly, "It's nice seeing you in charge again, ma'am." I thanked him, not just for the gesture, but for the way he said again, as if acknowledging a truth we'd both known for years. Adam spent more time at home now, eating dinners with me in the conservatory instead of glued to screens in his office. We didn't talk about Clara every night. Sometimes we just shared stories about Richard or watched the news in silence. But the tension between us had softened. Guilt had turned to reflection, and reflection into a kind of cautious rebuilding. For the first time in years, I could see my son without seeing the shadow of his wife beside him. One morning, I received a call from Peter, the private investigator, who had continued following leads related to Clara's previous transactions. "We found a safe deposit box in her maiden name," he said. "Registered in a secondary bank downtown. It wasn't tied to any of the shared accounts with Adam." My grip on the phone tightened. "What's inside?" I asked. "Too early to tell," he replied. "We've requested a court order to open it legally." Evelyn confirmed that the DA's office had already drafted the necessary paperwork, citing concealment of potential stolen property. I sat on the edge of the window bench, watching the early autumn leaves drift past the glass like copper feathers. "She really thought I'd never fight back," I murmured. "She spent so long mocking me in this house, and now she's hoarding things she thought I'd never find." Peter's voice was calm. "She underestimated you, Mrs. Helena. They usually do." 3 days later, Peter called again, this time with the results. Inside the box were 4 additional pieces from my collection: a diamond-studded watch, a gold and emerald brooch, 2 rare coins Richard had collected in his final years. Also inside was a handwritten ledger, Clara's own notes, complete with dates, estimated values, and discrete checkmarks beside each item sold. Evelyn reviewed the documents with silent fury, her pen scratching against the paper as she compiled evidence. "This eliminates any remaining doubt about her intent," she said. "This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was premeditated theft over the course of months." I nodded slowly, the confirmation settling into my bones like cold air. The betrayal hadn't been random. It had been strategic. And now we had proof straight from Clara's own hand. When Evelyn submitted the new evidence to the DA, everything accelerated. The prosecution added 2 new charges: concealment of assets and fraudulent misrepresentation. Stanton, Clara's lawyer, reached out to propose a plea bargain in exchange for reducing the sentencing window. Evelyn asked me what I wanted. "I don't want leniency," I said. "I want clarity." If Clara was willing to confess everything in writing, detail each theft and sale, and return every remaining item within her control, I would agree to a sentencing recommendation on the lower end. Evelyn relayed the terms. Stanton agreed, but added one request. Clara wanted to deliver the confession to me in person. I considered the offer, then gave a single nod. Let her look me in the eye while she explains who she really is. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in a neutral room at the courthouse, glass-walled and echoing with fluorescent light. Clara was brought in quietly, no handcuffs, dressed in gray again, but this time cleaner, sharper, an attempt, perhaps, to reclaim the image she'd once clung to. I sat with Evelyn beside me, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Clara sat across the table, her lawyer to her left, a thin folder placed in front of her. She didn't speak right away. She opened the folder and slid it toward me. "Everything's in there," she said softly. "Every item I took, every dealer I sold to, every lie I told. You were right about me, Helena. I thought you were too small to notice." I didn't touch the folder. I wanted her to keep talking. "I didn't just steal from you," she said, her voice steadying. "I erased you. Every time I rolled my eyes, every time I laughed behind your back, every time I made Adam ignore you, I was trying to shrink you out of your own house." She looked away for the first time. And the worst part is, it worked. For a while. Her voice cracked but didn't break. "You weren't supposed to fight back. You weren't supposed to matter." I finally leaned forward. "That's your problem, Clara. You thought being quiet meant I was weak. You mistook grace for fragility. And now, you'll live with what you did." Clara didn't respond to my words right away, just sat there with her hands folded, as if trying to calculate how far sincerity might carry her. Her face, usually so composed, now betrayed flickers of something closer to understanding than regret. "I wanted to matter," she said again, but softer this time, like the echo of a child's voice in a room she'd been banished from. Evelyn didn't interrupt, though I knew her mind was parsing every word Clara said for its legal utility. Stanton remained still, no interruptions or spin, which told me they both understood this wasn't a negotiation anymore, it was a reckoning. Clara looked up, locking eyes with me in a way she hadn't since before the wedding. "I thought if I took pieces of the house, your jewelry, your place, your son, I could build something that felt like mine," she admitted. "But it never felt like mine, Helena. Not really. Because you were still here, and I couldn't erase that." I sat straighter in my chair, the sting in my chest more from truth than betrayal. "I wasn't here to haunt you, Clara. I was here because this was my home." She blinked at that, perhaps surprised I wasn't lashing out, but I had long passed the desire for fury. What I wanted now was accountability, not just legal, but emotional, something deeper than courtroom outcomes. Clara took a shaky breath and reached into her folder again, pulling out a smaller envelope sealed in gold wax. "This isn't part of the official confession," she said, sliding it toward me. "It's personal. You can read it later or never. I just wanted to leave something behind that didn't reek of theft." I made no move to touch the envelope yet, choosing instead to study her face. For once, there was no makeup, no armor, no air of superiority. Just a woman who had finally run out of illusions and found nothing underneath but shame. Evelyn cleared her throat gently, signaling we had reached the end. Clara looked at me one last time and whispered, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But thank you for making me face the truth." The weeks following the confession passed in a strange calm, the kind that settles over a battlefield after the dust has cleared, but the echoes still linger. I kept the envelope in my nightstand drawer, unopened, unsure if reading it would bring peace or reopen wounds. Evelyn filed the documents officially, and the judge accepted Clara's plea deal based on her full confession and asset recovery. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 3, provided she met all restitution terms. The judge's final words stayed with me. This case was never about a single ring. It was about a pattern of cruelty masked as class, theft disguised as entitlement, and silence misread as consent. Clara cried quietly in court, not with theatrics, but with the subdued guilt of someone who finally understood what she had lost. Adam stood beside me during sentencing, his face unreadable, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder for the first time in years. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked questions I didn't answer. I had already said everything I needed to say, not through speeches, but through the simple act of not backing down. The world had seen the story, but only I knew how much it had cost. Back at home, The estate felt different, not just because Clara was gone, but because I was present in ways I hadn't allowed myself to be in a long time. I reclaimed the front room slowly, not with grand gestures, but with little things. I replaced the paintings Clara had removed with ones Richard and I had chosen together decades ago. I had the antique rug in the sitting room cleaned and rolled out again, its deep colors warming the floor like memory made visible. I moved my tea set back to the parlor cabinet, where it had once belonged before being boxed away to make room for Clara's minimalist crystalware. Adam helped with some of the heavier tasks without being asked, moving boxes and rearranging furniture with quiet diligence. We didn't talk much during these moments, but we didn't need to. Something broken was being mended, not erased, not forgotten, but stitched together with a thread of effort. One evening, after we'd hung the last of the old photographs in the hallway, Adam looked at me and said, "I should have protected you better." I turned to him, touched his cheek gently, and replied, "Now you are." 3 months into Clara's sentence, the media attention faded, and the house grew quieter, finally allowed to breathe. The gallery owner, Elise, returned the 2 stolen pieces she had unknowingly purchased, and insisted on hosting a private showing dedicated to the legacy of estate jewelry and preservation. "I'd like to honor what was nearly lost," she said. I agreed, under one condition: no mention of Clara, only of the collection's history and Richard's passion for craftsmanship. The showing was elegant, tasteful, and surprisingly cathartic. For the first time in years, I saw guests genuinely curious about me, not as an accessory to their host, but as the storyteller, the keeper of something meaningful. A local journalist asked for a quote, and I offered only this: "It's never too late to reclaim your place." After the event, I sat alone in the gallery for a few minutes, surrounded by glass cases holding pieces that had survived lies and nearly disappeared. I thought about Richard, and I whispered, "We kept it safe, love." Even when no one believed I could. Adam slowly began rebuilding his own life, choosing to focus more on the family business and spending less time trying to impress the shallow crowd Clara had once courted. He cut ties with several mutual friends who had turned cold after the scandal, finally recognizing who valued image over integrity. We had long conversations over coffee, sometimes laughing, sometimes pausing when the past felt too heavy. One day, he brought home a dusty box from the attic marked Dad's Letters, and we spent the afternoon reading them aloud in the sunroom. They were full of wisdom, humor, and small pieces of Richard's quiet strength, the kind of man who knew what mattered even when no one else did. "He always believed in you," Adam said, his voice quiet. "He told me once that you could outlast anyone if you decided to." I smiled, blinking back tears. I just needed to remember that for myself. The letter from Clara remained unopened until the first day of winter, when frost touched the garden and silence blanketed the estate like a soft warning. I sat by the fireplace, fingers brushing the sealed envelope, unsure if I was ready for what was inside. But something told me it was time, not for closure, but for honesty. I broke the wax seal and unfolded the pages carefully. Her handwriting was as neat as ever, but the tone had changed. She spoke of loneliness, of the fear of being irrelevant, of how she confused possession with belonging. She admitted that every time I smiled despite her cruelty, it unsettled her more than rage would have. "You carry dignity like a weapon," she wrote. And I mistook it for weakness. She didn't ask for forgiveness this time. She only said, "I hope one day, when you look at the things I tried to take, you'll remember they were yours before I even arrived." I closed the letter and returned it to the drawer, not out of hatred, but because I had nothing more to prove. By the time spring arrived, the estate was blooming in a way it hadn't in years, not just with flowers, but with peace. I had the rose garden replanted in Richard's layout, using the same heirloom bulbs we'd once chosen from catalogs late at night over chamomile tea. The petals were fuller this year, or maybe it just felt that way without Clara's voice echoing from the veranda, criticizing every imperfection. The staff, once cautious and deferential to a fault, now chatted comfortably with me as they worked, no longer walking on eggshells. I hosted tea again for the first time since Richard passed, inviting old friends and neighbors I hadn't seen in years. They came hesitantly at first, unsure if the scandal had made me reclusive or bitter, but left laughing and full of scones. One even said, "It's like you're back," and I answered softly, "I was never gone, just quiet." Adam stopped by more often now, sometimes with folders of business updates, sometimes just with a bottle of wine. We started cooking together again, simple meals that reminded us both of who we'd been before everything was complicated. The house was no longer just walls and inheritance, it was mine again. Clara had written 2 more letters from prison, both forwarded through Evelyn, and both still sealed in my nightstand drawer. I hadn't decided what to do with them, and Evelyn never asked, which I appreciated. "You don't owe her anything," she reminded me once, not with venom, but with clarity. Clara's restitution payments were being made, slow but steady, through the court-ordered plan tied to her sentence. Some of the money came from liquidating her personal assets, designer clothing, handbags, and jewelry she hadn't yet sold. A portion of the recovered items from the deposit box and pawns had also been returned, though a few were still missing. One of the missing pieces was a small silver locket Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary. It wasn't worth much monetarily, but I kept hoping it would show up. "Sometimes the things with the least value to others mean the most to us," Evelyn had said. And she was right. I missed that locket more than I missed any gemstone. One quiet Thursday morning, the estate gate intercom buzzed unexpectedly. It was a courier, holding a small package addressed to me with no return name, only initials scrawled in black ink. I accepted it cautiously, setting it on the dining room table with a weight that didn't feel like coincidence. When I opened it, nestled inside a velvet pouch was the missing silver locket. No note. No explanation. Just the piece I thought was gone forever, returned in silence. I clutched it in my palm and closed my eyes, letting the memories of Richard's laughter flood through me like music on old vinyl. I didn't need to ask who sent it. Some things are said louder without words. Later that day, Adam found me in the library, the locket around my neck and a mug of tea cooling beside me. "It's back," he said softly, eyes widening when he recognized it. I nodded. "No name, but I know." He sat beside me on the tufted settee, hesitating. "Mom, I've been thinking." I looked over at him. "About what?" "About what it means to rebuild a life after you realize it wasn't built on the right foundation to begin with." I waited, sipping my tea. "I've been offered a position abroad," he finally said. "And I think I might take it." The words hit harder than I expected, not with anger, but with the ache of another change I wasn't quite ready for. "Where?" I asked after a long pause. "Lisbon," he replied. "A small design consultancy that works with international firms. They need someone with my experience, and I need a reset." I nodded, letting it settle. "You deserve a fresh start," I said. "But this doesn't mean you're running away, does it?" He shook his head. "No, Mom. This time I'm walking toward something, not away from anyone." The pride that rose in me was sharp and bright, like sunlight on clean glass. I reached for his hand. "Then I'm proud of you." In the weeks that followed, we prepared together, closing up some of his files, making sure the transition at the family firm would be smooth. Adam found a tenant for the east wing of the estate, a retired schoolteacher who loved gardens and old books. She would move in quietly and respectfully, without the sense of entitlement that had once filled these halls. I began writing again, not fiction, but memories, small essays about life with Richard, about the little things I'd never told anyone. Evelyn suggested I compile them into a book. "Call it The Quiet Room," she said with a wink. "Because the quiet ones always have the best stories." I laughed, touched by her faith in me. The idea didn't seem ridiculous anymore. It felt like a natural step in my own restoration. One night, before Adam left, we stood on the back patio overlooking the newly blooming garden. The moonlight dusted the hedges in silver, and the fountain trickled gently behind us. "Will you be okay here?" he asked. "Alone?" I turned to him, my eyes steady. I was alone before Clara ever arrived. "I'll be just fine without the noise." He nodded, wrapping me in an embrace that was tighter than any he'd given in years. "I love you, Mom," he whispered. I closed my eyes. "I know. And I love the man you're becoming." We stood there in silence, two people who had survived betrayal, rediscovered truth, and found the courage to begin again. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. Adam left 2 weeks later, his luggage neatly packed into the car that would take him to the airport just after sunrise. I stood in the driveway, wrapped in a shawl, watching him load the last of his bags, the morning fog curling around us like a farewell curtain. "You'll visit, won't you?" I asked, not needing the reassurance, but wanting to hear it. "As often as I can," he said, pulling me into a long, warm hug. He smelled like coffee and cologne and something else I hadn't noticed in years. Peace. When the car pulled away, I waved until the tail lights disappeared beyond the hedges, then stood alone, letting the quiet settle back over the estate like an old friend. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. I walked back inside, past the rooms that no longer felt haunted by memories of control or disdain, and brewed myself a cup of tea. For the first time in decades, my house, my life, belonged entirely to me. With Adam gone and the estate now quiet and orderly, I returned to writing in earnest, shaping the essays into something more structured. Each story was a small window into the life I'd lived, the lessons I'd hidden, the strength I'd cultivated while others assumed I had none. Evelyn reviewed the manuscript for legal concerns and offered to introduce me to a small publisher she trusted. "You don't need this to be a bestseller," she said. "You just need it to be honest." I titled the book The Quiet Room, just as she'd suggested, and each chapter carried the name of a place in the house Clara had tried to erase me from. The kitchen, where I once made lavender shortbread while she mocked my recipes. The conservatory, where I used to tend orchids until Clara replaced them with sterile glass sculptures. The hallway, where I'd stood at family dinners listening to her laugh as if I wasn't 3 feet away. My words were not bitter, but clear, a map of survival built on stillness. The publisher loved the concept and fast-tracked the printing. I signed the first copy with a pen Richard had given me on our 20th anniversary and tucked it onto the shelf in the library, beside his books. 2 months after Adam's departure, I received a letter from the prison, this one not from Clara, but from a woman named Angela who worked in the prison library. "Your daughter-in-law donated a copy of your book," it read, "and several of the women here have been passing it around like scripture." I read the letter twice, unsure how to process the idea of Clara quietly sharing my words with strangers behind bars. Angela continued, "Some of us didn't realize how many versions of silence exist until we read your stories. We've decided to start a writing group. Thank you for giving us a voice." I sat in the study holding the letter to my chest, moved in a way I hadn't expected. I hadn't written the book for sympathy or acclaim, only to reclaim the parts of myself that had been erased. But somehow, that reclamation had reached further than I imagined. The story had started as mine and now belonged to others too, women who, like me, had once been silenced and forgotten. It was near midsummer when I received another surprise, a phone call from Elise, the gallery owner. "Helena," she said with excitement, "I've been invited to curate an exhibit on legacy collections, and I want to feature your story, with your permission, of course." I hesitated. "My story or the scandal?" I asked. "Your legacy," she replied gently. "The story of your family's collection, your husband's quiet investment in craftsmanship, and your journey to protect what mattered." I agreed, under the condition that no mention of Clara be included. Elise honored that without question. The exhibit, titled Silent Strength, opened in late July with soft lighting, velvet curtains, and a subtle elegance that Richard would have adored. I attended the opening in a deep plum dress and wore the silver locket Clara had returned, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as a symbol of survival. Guests moved slowly through the exhibit, pausing to admire pieces of the collection that had once sat unnoticed in my room. There were informational plaques describing the origin of each item, many referencing the quiet passion of Richard's collecting and the careful preservation I had maintained. A photo of the larkspur ring sat behind glass, accompanied by a short description, a piece that survived not just time, but betrayal. I watched from a quiet corner as a group of students discussed its design and history, their interest genuine, their curiosity unburdened by scandal. One young woman turned to her friend and said, Whoever protected this must have had guts. I smiled. The recognition wasn't loud, but it was there. Elise found me before I left and handed me a small framed print from the exhibit, a quote from my book written in elegant script. It read, "Sometimes the strongest walls are the ones no one sees you build." I thanked her with tears in my eyes. In late August, I received a final notice from the court. Clara had been denied early parole. Her behavior had been good, her payments consistent, but the parole board felt she hadn't demonstrated a full understanding of her impact. Evelyn read the letter aloud over tea, her tone neutral but firm. "She'll serve the full 5 years," she said. "No appeals left." I nodded slowly, not out of joy, but out of finality. There was no satisfaction in punishment, only closure in truth. Evelyn asked if I felt any desire to respond to Clara's earlier letters, the 2 I still hadn't opened. "No," I said simply. "She has her truth now, and I have mine. There's nothing else left between us to untangle." That fall, the estate was more vibrant than I'd ever seen it, vines curling around the trellises, the roses blooming wildly, as if they too had been holding their breath all these years. I hired a local high school art club to repaint the garden benches and clean the old statues Richard once called our guardians. The young artists worked diligently, respectful and bright-eyed, asking questions about the estate's history and laughing as they painted in the afternoon sun. One of them, a girl named Naomi, asked if I ever got lonely. I looked out at the garden and said, "No, dear. I get peaceful." She smiled and said, "I want to be like that when I'm older, peaceful, and powerful." I laughed gently and offered them fresh lemonade from the porch. The house, once ruled by tension and control, had become a haven again, not just for me, but for others seeking something softer, truer. As the first chill of autumn touched the air, I found myself drawn more often to the sunroom, where the light poured through the tall windows and warmed the floor tiles like a silent embrace. I kept a blanket folded over the armchair, the one Richard used to claim as his reading throne, and I often sat there with a cup of tea and a pen in hand. The second printing of The Quiet Room had just been released, and letters from readers across the country arrived weekly, handwritten notes, emails printed by Evelyn's assistant, even a few phone calls forwarded to the estate. One letter came from a woman in Kansas who said my story gave her the courage to confront her daughter's husband for stealing from her pension. Another came from a retired librarian in Maine who had formed a Quiet Resilience book club inspired by my essays. They weren't just responding to the scandal or the revenge, they were responding to the stillness, to the quiet strength they saw in the spaces between what I'd said and what I hadn't. And maybe that was always my greatest weapon, not the silence itself, but the choice to hold it until I was ready to speak. I answered every letter I could in my own handwriting because I knew what it meant to feel unseen. I may have lived in the background for years, but now my voice echoed in homes I would never visit, reaching women who had forgotten their power. That November, I hosted a small dinner at the estate, nothing extravagant, just 6 guests who had, in their own ways, supported me through the storm. Evelyn came, of course, arriving with a bottle of Bordeaux and her usual understated elegance. Elise brought a bouquet of dried wildflowers and a leather-bound copy of the Silent Strength exhibit catalog, which now included a foreword about the emotional history behind legacies. Martin, the gardener, shyly accepted his invitation and brought a warm pear tart his wife had made, beaming with pride when I placed it in the center of the table. Naomi, the art student, joined us too. I had invited her after reading her short story for a school project about women finding their voices. 2 of my oldest friends, Beatrice and Helen, rounded out the table, both of them curious, kind, and finally comfortable enough to laugh again in my presence without fear of stepping on social eggshells. The dining room, once dimmed by years of cold conversation and stifled words, now sparkled with candlelight and warmth. We toasted not to revenge or victory, but to truth, to survival, to the invisible becoming visible. It was the first holiday season in 15 years where I didn't feel like a guest in my own home. I was the host, the matriarch, the storyteller, and I had earned every chair at that table. Just before Christmas, a parcel arrived from Lisbon with no return address, but handwriting I recognized immediately. Adam had written in blue ink, the lines tight and slightly slanted, just as they were when he was a child trying to impress his teachers. The envelope contained a photograph of him standing in front of a stone archway lined with vines, smiling more openly than I'd seen in years. Behind him stood a woman, tall, olive-skinned, her hand gently resting on his shoulder, and in the back was a small dog with comically large ears and a lopsided grin. The letter was brief, but full of heart. Mom, I've met someone kind, someone who doesn't need to be the loudest voice in the room to matter. Her name is Anna. She knows all about you, and she can't wait to meet you. I'm happy, and I think you'd like her. I read the letter 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because it was the kind of peace I had once feared my son would never find. I placed the photo in a frame beside Richard's and whispered, "He's finding his way now. You'd be proud." On New Year's Eve, I stayed up late, bundled in a shawl and watching the garden lights shimmer through the frost-covered windows. I didn't feel the need to go out to attend parties or gatherings because everything I needed was already within reach. At midnight, the bells from the town church rang in the distance, a soft, solemn echo that carried through the still air like a whispered promise. I raised my teacup to the empty room and said aloud to the quiet ones, "May we never be overlooked again." Somewhere deep in the house, a clock chimed in reply, and I smiled. This home, once a place of tension and erasure, now breathed with rhythm again, with stories layered into its every corner. I thought briefly of Clara, wherever she was spending that night, and felt no hatred, only the distance of a chapter closed. She would finish her sentence, live her life however she chose, but she would no longer shape mine. That power had been taken back. In early spring, I received a formal invitation to speak at a women's conference on inheritance and legacy, not about wealth, but about emotional resilience and self-reclamation. Evelyn encouraged me to accept. "You're not just the story anymore, Helena. You're the voice behind it." I agreed under one condition, that the session be called The Art of Returning. Not revenge, not restitution, but return. Returning to your own life, your own self, your own name after years of it being spoken by someone else's mouth. The auditorium was modest, filled with women of all ages, each holding a copy of my book in their laps or scribbled notes on yellow pads. I walked onto the stage not as a speaker, but as a survivor. They called me invisible, I began. And so I let them. Until I remembered how brightly I could see, even in the dark. The room fell silent, and I knew my voice no longer belonged only to me. After the conference, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes and said, "My daughter-in-law is starting to act like Clara did, controlling, dismissive, turning my own son against me. What should I do?" I placed a hand on hers and replied, "Start documenting. Speak softly, but keep your records loud. And don't wait 10 years like I did." She nodded, strength slowly rising behind her sorrow. Each story I heard felt familiar, like echoes of my own woven into other lives. I no longer felt isolated in my experience. I felt connected to a lineage of women who had learned to bend without breaking. We were not victims of time, we were keepers of it. And we were reclaiming every lost second. That evening, I returned home and walked the garden path, pausing by the fountain where Clara once suggested we modernize the estate for appearances. The fountain still stood, its moss-covered stone weathered but proud, water dancing with soft defiance. I reached down and touched the rim, then looked around at the garden that had outlasted so many storms, literal and otherwise. The roses were budding again early this year, as if eager to bloom. I knew there were still chapters of life left for me, quiet ones, perhaps, but meaningful. I wasn't afraid of solitude anymore. I wasn't afraid of being underestimated. The quiet woman in the corner had spoken. And the world, finally, had listened. 1 year to the day after Clara was sentenced, I received a simple white envelope in the mail with no return address, just a neatly printed postmark from the county facility. It wasn't a letter, it was a notice confirming the completion of a restitution milestone. Half the owed value had been repaid. The enclosed receipt showed contributions from the auction of remaining luxury items Clara once hoarded, designer shoes, an exclusive membership to a private club, A vintage purse she'd once bragged had belonged to a senator's wife. Evelyn reviewed the paperwork, double-checked the legal signatures, and handed it back to me with a look of quiet satisfaction. "It doesn't fix everything," she said, "but it proves the system worked this time, because you didn't flinch." I placed the document in the estate's legal ledger, between the trust update and Richard's original collection index. The past didn't disappear, but it was finally documented, sealed, addressed, and stored where it could no longer wound me. I didn't tell Adam about the notice right away. There was no urgency. It wasn't a victory worth celebrating, only a confirmation that consequence had followed action. And I had already chosen to celebrate something else, the return of my life. That weekend, Adam arrived for his first visit since Lisbon, with Anna and the dog, whose name, I quickly learned, was Bruno. Bruno was small and energetic, with a crooked tail and the kind of face that always looked confused in a charming way. Anna greeted me with a bouquet of white tulips and eyes full of kindness, and she immediately offered to help in the kitchen, a gesture that said more than any speech could. We ate dinner on the veranda, the lights strung between the columns glowing gold as the evening wrapped around us in silence and laughter. Adam looked healthier, more grounded, less like the man who once paced halls while avoiding difficult truths. He told me about his new job, the coastal apartment, and how Anna taught yoga on weekends and volunteered at an animal shelter. "We're not rushing anything," he said at one point, "but it feels like we're building something real this time." I smiled, knowing exactly what that meant. Not just love, but respect, safety, and space to grow. And when Anna reached over to quietly squeeze his hand, I felt something close in me finally exhale. That night, Anna and I stayed up a little longer, sipping mint tea in the library while Adam and Bruno napped upstairs. "I've read your book 3 times, she said, not shy, not fawning, just honest. "Every woman in my family has a copy now." I chuckled softly and said, "I never thought it would be a family heirloom." She nodded toward the framed photo of Richard on the mantel. He must have been a remarkable man to recognize that kind of strength in someone before anyone else did. I looked at the picture, feeling both grief and gratitude. "He never doubted me," I replied, "even when I doubted myself." Anna asked gentle questions about the estate, the gardens, and the way things had changed over the years. She didn't pry, but listened with a warmth that made it easy to speak, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt not just heard, but understood. The following morning, Adam took Anna on a walk through the orchard, and I stayed back to tend to the roses. I wore my gardening gloves and Richard's old sun hat, humming as I clipped away dead leaves and whispered encouragement to new buds. The locket hung lightly around my neck, tapping against my chest each time I reached forward, a rhythm I had come to find soothing. Bruno padded out from the house and sat in the grass nearby, tilting his head as though listening to my thoughts. "I think we're going to keep you," I told him. "You've got a good heart and funny ears." He wagged his tail once and flopped onto his side, satisfied. When Adam returned, he found me kneeling beside the rose bushes, humming a tune his father once played on the piano. "Mom," he said quietly, "we've been talking, and we'd like to name our first daughter Helena, if that ever happens." I stood, brushing the dirt from my knees. "Then she'll be born with fire in her bones," I said, smiling. A month later, Elise called with news that left me speechless. Silent Strength would be going on tour, featured in galleries across 6 major cities. "They want your story front and center," she said. "It's not just about jewelry anymore. It's about survival, legacy, and reclaiming your space." She asked if I would be willing to record a short video message for the exhibit. At first, I hesitated. I'd grown comfortable in the quiet of my estate, far from cameras or staged lighting. But then I remembered Angela's letter from the prison library, Naomi's short story, and the woman from the conference who had whispered, "I see myself in your pages." So I said yes. We recorded it in the conservatory, where the light filtered gently through the glass, and I wore the emerald brooch Richard had given me the year before he died. "This is not a story of revenge," I said into the lens. "This is a story of remembering who you are before someone else told you to forget." The tour launched in early summer, and photos poured in from attendees across the country, women standing in front of the exhibit with tear-streaked cheeks, mothers holding daughters' hands, teachers sharing quotes from my book in their classrooms. One image showed a woman in a wheelchair reaching out to touch the glass in front of the Larkspur Ring, her expression filled with awe. Another was from a college campus, where a group of students created a mural with lines from The Quiet Room, spray-painted in elegant cursive across a brick wall. Evelyn sent updates regularly, each more moving than the last. The story that had once been buried under years of silence had grown roots, risen, and bloomed in places I'd never imagined. And I realized then that my voice was no longer just mine, it was a thread in something larger, something ongoing. Not a monument to pain, but a map toward healing. I had reclaimed my legacy, not through noise, but through truth. That autumn, as the leaves turned copper and crimson and the estate prepared for another quiet winter, I walked the length of the garden one last time before dusk. The wind was soft, the sky painted in strokes of lavender and rose. I paused at the bench where I once sat, phone in hand, reading the message that started it all. I borrowed your old ring for the party. Hope you don't mind. I closed my eyes, not in bitterness, but in gratitude, because from that single act of theft, I had found a depth of strength I never knew I carried. I sat down, Bruno at my feet, and opened my journal to write the final line of my second book. Let them think you are quiet. Let them mistake you for soft. And then show them what you built in silence. As the last light dipped behind the trees, I knew I was not just restored. I was transformed. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you leave, there's another story similar to the one you just watched. You'll see it on the top left of your screen.